place. Okay, so we have this concept of the bandwidth blueprint. And basically, the main idea of this is that we're going to build in a couple of virtuous circles throughout the various different domains of your life and find a way to make everything better incrementally. I work with the general idea here that you can have everything you want, but you can't have everything you want all at once. So we need to be a little patient. We may need to prioritize, but we're going to look at how we can optimize for a sense of well-being in our lives. And I define well-being a specific way, pulled from a couple of researchers, Valerie Tiberius and Colin DeYoung. They put forth this cybernetic value fulfillment theory that I think gives us a great operational definition of well-being, which is your ability to get what you want. Simple. Now, I modify that slightly. I say, okay, well-being is getting and keeping what you want. Because many of us learn the hard way. There is a world of difference between what you can achieve and what you can sustain. And if you push yourself very hard and achieve something and fail to establish the processes, the systems that are going to help you maintain that, well, then you're just going to achieve and then have that very painful experience of losing it. And then maybe work so hard to achieve and then painful experience of losing it. As anybody who has yo-yo dieted can attest to, or has pushed themselves really hard for business only to hit a wall and then collapse and need a break, and you recover and push and hit a wall and collapse. These things are very demoralizing across time. It's expensive to fail. So we're going to look as we go through this at how we can avoid failure as well. So if well-being is a matter of getting and keeping what you want, we might look at a couple of primary obstacles to that. And for entrepreneurs in particular, there are three main factors that will contribute to burnout, or essentially persistent failure to get and keep what you want. These three factors are role ambiguity, which is to say, as an entrepreneur, it's never entirely certain what your job is, what you're supposed to be doing. There's always kind of a question mark. It can be a little fuzzy. So role ambiguity is one of these. Role overload is another, which is to say the demands of the role to be performed may simply exceed capacity. And by God, many of us have an easy time biting off more than we can chew. And that isn't very sustainable. The third factor here is role conflict. And that's when the various hats that we wear come into conflict with each other as a result of us having limited time, energy, attention, cash to deploy on any given day, any given week. So we're going to see what we can do to address and mitigate these three risk factors: ambiguity, overload, and conflict. And I think you'll find that the system we put together here is fairly elegant. But if well-being is the getting and keeping of what you want, it would be wise for us to define what that is. Going through this particular program, this workshop, this whatever, I'm willing to bet you've given some thought to that. The question is, can we very clearly define what you want? And so if you have a sheet of paper handy, maybe multiple sheets of paper handy, I would really encourage a bit of time spent in reflection. And we'll approach this from a particular lens. So you could, on a piece of paper, write down any and everything that comes to mind with regards to what you want. I'm going to encourage you to consider it from the perspective of the minimum criteria to satisfy what you want, which is to say, define all of what you want with respect to what is good enough. So if you just crossed that threshold of good enough, everything above that, it's a bonus. It's better than good enough. But if all you did was reach that level, well, that's good enough. The reason why this is so important is that many of us struggle with a sense of nothing ever being good enough. And by God, a large part of that is that we've never actually defined for ourselves what constitutes good enough. So, in a moment, I will pause the recording. We'll have a little time to write whatever comes to mind. We can workshop it a bit, but let's start with this. What is going to be good enough in terms of any and every goal that comes to mind for you, for what you want and don't have, as well as what you have and don't want? And we'll spend a little time with that. So, an important qualifier comes up as we workshop this a bit, and that is that these are entirely your criteria. The worst part about well-being is when we go and accomplish what we think we ought to want, or what we want to want, what we're supposed to want. Frankly, any extra words scaffolded around want, it's going to be tough for us. So if I find myself wanting to want a thing, that's maybe a good sign for me that I don't actually want that thing. Yeah, terrible. If I am pursuing something that I ought to want, or I'm supposed to want, it is going to be very difficult for me to make use of my internal endogenous motivational processes to pursue that thing. So again, when we're defining minimum criteria for what you want, this really is what you want. And this is where a lot of people find that they actually have a tough time connecting with a sense of what they want. So, before passing go, before scurrying onward through the material, like if you need, as you watch through this, to spend some time getting a sense of what you want, it is okay to take a good amount of time to clarify what you want, because it is far more productive, far more effective in the long term to be working towards something you genuinely want. I'm always amazed at the people who will sweat the small stuff. They'll spend a lot of time optimizing their daily rhythms or their weekly rhythms, all in pursuit of shit that doesn't matter to them. So they will waste years in the wrong pursuit, and they'll optimize every little nitty gritty step of the way, every hour in the day, every day in the week. They'll block out all these times without really clarifying for themselves at the end of the day where they want to end up, the kind of future they would like to indwell. So again, given that the cybernetic basis is so much of what we're up to, we need to specify the goal in order to get accurate feedback of our current state with respect to that goal. Because it's that gap between where I want to go and where I am currently that's going to inform my best next step. So hopefully at this point, we've got a decent list of all the things that you want, things that you want and don't have, things that you have and don't want, and the minimum criteria for what constitutes good enough on each of those goals. So maybe it is not the optimum strength output that you could produce, but maybe you say good enough is, I don't know, I want to maintain deadlifting 2.5 times my body weight, or squatting double body weight. Or maybe good enough is I take home $8,000 a month in profit for my business to cover all my base expenses. Maybe good enough is whatever the case is. I have 2 dates each week, and it's tango dancing one night, it's this the other night, and then we have 90 minutes to talk about the relationship so that we can put out any fires. Like, again, for all of the different roles that you play, and we'll talk more about this role situation, a little further on, but each of these roles has particular goals. And everybody's going to have different ways to slice and dice their particular roles. I find most commonly we can look at the roles of partner or parent. So let's say relationships generally. We can look at the role of business owner, and we can look at the role of the person, which could be, their relationship with their health, their mental well-being, their spirituality, their scholarly pursuits, whatever the case is. So we'll have these different roles and different goals. And again, we'll have more to say about that. But as you look at this list of what you want, it's going to be very important for us to then identify what are the primary constraints. Inevitably, if there were no obstacles, you would just have all of what you want and don't have, and get rid of what you have and don't want. But with all of these wants, there's going to be a but, and potentially many of them, and potentially they're big ones. So I wonder what occurs to you in the ... after the phrase, I want all of this, but ... There are going to be some obstacles. And so maybe it's something like, well, I want to improve my physical fitness generally, but I don't have enough time. I want to go out and introduce more offers to the marketplace, but I'm afraid I'm going to look like an idiot. I want to yada, 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 but this, that, and the other. So let's also spend a few moments. Again, maybe it's a different sheet of paper, same one with a line on it, whatever the case is. Let's write out any and everything that comes to mind regarding the buts. Because until we can address these particular constraints, we can put as much oomph as we want into our pursuit of those goals. But if we're driving with the parking brake on, so to speak, we're going to have a tough time. So again, in a moment, I'll pause the recording. We can spend a little time talking through some of these things, but if you're catching the recording, watching through, you've got a list of what you want. We're also going to put together a list of the buts. I want this, but that seems to be getting in the way. So what comes to mind here? So you likely have then a list of buts. You've got a list of what you want, you got a list of buts, and of course, the terrible joke is they may be big ones. But, well, we'll see that there may be not such a problem after all. Now, there are a couple of ways we can address this. First, if you've gone through a workshop, maybe you've seen it called the potent pause or any number of things, take a look for a moment. We'll go through this practice here again as a reminder, but take a look for a moment at the list of what you want. And imagine to yourself that you've actually achieved that. You've fulfilled those values, you've achieved those goals, you've attained those possessions. Notice how your body responds to that. The idea of actually having, getting, keeping what you want. For most people, there's a sense of excitement, enjoyment. There's a positive feeling, maybe a bubbly kind of quality. Ooh, wow, yeah, it feels good to imagine all that. Then notice what happens when you shift your attention to all of the constraints, all of the buts here. You look at all those obstacles. And what most people find is in the first moment they start to consider all of the buts, there's the brace of tension, there's collapse, a heavy, sluggish quality. And if that is not apparent, you might take a couple of moments and shift your attention to the list of everything you want. And notice how your body responds, and shift back to the list of all the constraints. And that pendulum between this and that, this And that can really clarify the difference in embodied experience here. And part of the reason why I find this is of such importance for us is that this characteristic experience, when we read the list of constraints, this is the affective embodiment of shame. This is shame. This is the thwarting of our desire. And most of us have become so habituated to the experience of shame that we hardly notice it. And it tends to be most people's default stance in the world, which is a hell of a problem if we're looking to get things done, because shame thwarts action. Physiologically, it puts the brakes on our continued movement out in the world. You can think it gets conditioned through a series of encounters with caregivers early in life that go a little something like this. I reach for the light socket because it looks like something really fun I could stick my finger or this fork into. And my parent goes, "No, stop." I collapse into tears. The function of shame isn't actually all bad. It's a preservative, quite frankly, in terms of keeping us from doing stupid shit in our youth. However, it's an incredibly painful misattunement relationally. And some of the earliest examples of this, they call it the bangable incident. An infant will lift up some precious toy or a glass or something, and they're so excited to drop the thing, and they look with excitement toward the caregiver and they say, what fun, we're going to destroy this, eh? And the caregiver goes, ah. So the infant looks toward the caregiver, expecting to see a positive attunement. And what they get in response is a painful misattunement. Shame is essentially the experience of being looked at in a devaluing way by a valued other. And what happens then when the caregiver looks not with excitement or positive resonance, but with anger or distress or dismay, disgust, any of these negatively valenced emotions, the infant finds themselves in a terrible situation. The person on whom their life depends is not pleased with something they're doing, with the action that they're taking. And so what happens? Well, the action is thwarted. Shame creates this parasympathetic intensification wherein the infant goes through, infant, toddler, 30, 40-year-old person, whoever, at any age, they go through this parasympathetic situation that actually shuts down their psychophysiology. Shame initiates a collapse so that the action does not continue. Now, again, in and of itself, that's not such a big deal. It can be life-preserving at times. However, it's only life-preserving if it occurs in the context of a contained, emotionally secure, resonant relationship, let's say. So if an infant shame and upset and distress at their caregiver's failure to attune, this situation can be remedied if the caregivers, it's okay, and they downregulate, they meet the infant or the toddler in that lowered emotional state. They say, it's okay, they go through a rupture and they go through a repair. And the relationship can carry on quite well. However, most of us had many experiences of misattunement, or maybe we've come to internalize that experience of shame, and we walk around in a default state that is a little collapsed psychologically and physiologically. So our whole psychosomatic system becomes less potent than it otherwise might be as a result of these early misattunements. And again, you can get a sense of this in the moment without having to go dredge up the past in this experience of the contrast between how you feel yourself to be when you consider what you want and how you feel yourself to be when you consider the constraints. You are, I imagine, more potent, more expansive, more open, more available for the world when you consider what you want. And when you consider all of the buts, ooh, again, the collapse, the tension, the bracing, you likely shrink, you become a little smaller, the world seems to close just a bit. Now, one of the ways that we can begin to work with this and decondition this tendency so that you become more and more capable is when you consider the list of the constraints and you notice that crunching of your being. You could take a few moments then and shift your attention down to where your body makes contact with the supporting surface beneath you. And whether that is the chair, whether that's the floor, you simply shift your attention downward and you notice, there's a support there. Because the other thing with shame, in terms of that collapse, it's like the earth just opens and swallows us whole. So when we establish awareness of a base of support beneath us, without having to do much of anything outside of that, if we give it a few moments, we'll begin to notice we're buoyed upward bit by bit. And if you then consider the list of those constraints from that base of support, they likely don't have quite the same grip on. Now, that's an experiment worth running, seeing what changes in terms of your experience of those constraints from a base of awareness of support. Now, the other thing that's worth considering is that for many people, those constraints end up being, well, they end up being a good amount of worry for a lot of people. There are practical constraints that often arise, and we can address those as needed too. However, I think it's really worth highlighting that for a lot of people, a number of the constraints will fit into one of two categories. We'll say one of three categories. The first of these would be negative predictions about the future, which if we're not already familiar with, we will get to be more and more familiar with. Very briefly, as a recap of this process, if we notice that one of these constraints is, oh, I think it's just going to go terribly, I'm going to mess it up, oh, it's going to be awful, we'll just call that a negative prediction about the future. It is an idea about how the future will go that suggests the future is going to go badly. Yeah. Yeah. So when we find ourselves entertaining one of these thoughts, inevitably it's going to be anxiety provoking. I think, oh, I want this, but it's going to go terribly. I'm going to mess it up. I'm going to flub. You just notice how you feel when you entertain that thought. And then, as mentioned, you can pull out the crystal ball and see, am I actually able to predict the future with total certainty? Do I really believe that I know with absolute certainty, perfect predictive power, how the future is going to go? Generally speaking, we'll find that the answer is no. If the answer is yes, that is a separate conversation. We'll explore how you came into this magical power. But for most people going through most of these scenarios, the answer will be no. Can't predict with total certainty. We can then explore, what changes in your experience of yourself when you walk your energy and attention back from that negative prediction about the future? The second category that often arises in terms of a theme of these constraints has to do with mind reading, which again is another pattern of thought that is incredibly anxiety provoking. And whereas negative prediction goes something like, well, the future is going to be terrible, mind reading is a bit more like, I think other people are going to think I'm selfish. Where I think if I actually get what I want, it's going to create problems with my partner. I want to grow my business, but I'm afraid my spouse is going to be upset with me for working harder. I want to delegate these particular things in my business, but I'm afraid my employees are going to see me as demanding and tyrannical. Any number of situations like this. Again, these mind reads are a good opportunity to check in and see, how do I feel when I entertain this thought? And generally speaking, you feel badly when you entertain a thought like that. And this too is an opportunity to check in with the crystal ball and see, do I have the ability to know with total certainty what that other person thinks and feels about me right now? Again, for most people, going through most of these examples, they're going to find that no, I don't know with total certainty what that other person thinks. So then we can walk that energy and attention back from what we imagine is going on in another person's interiority. And we can see, what changes for me when I suspend that line of thinking? So when it comes to these constraints, again, just as a rolling recap here, it can be useful to consider them from a base of support so that physiologically we are more available for our resources that we bring to this problem. We can also check in with a bit of reality testing regarding problems that we imagine will arise in the future and negative judgments that we imagine other people will make of us. So checking in with reality can be really useful to rein in the anxiety of those things. And this often gets us to the point where we can kind of laugh off some of the ideas like, I told myself it was going to be doomsday, full on apocalypse. I want this, but my world's going to blow up. And well, no, I can't actually predict that. I don't actually know. Regarding the mind reading in particular, it takes a little bit of courage, but boy, it is so much easier just to ask the other person. Like if there actually is another constituent involved in this and you're worried about what they may think, you could just ask them. You could ask, for example, if it's a spouse is going to be worried about how much more you're working, you could go and ask them, hey, I want to bring the business up to X amount of revenue this year. But I'm worried that if I have to take on more work, you're going to be upset by that. Is that true? And whether they say yes or whether they say no, it's generally a relief because you've made contact with reality and you can then adjust your behavior accordingly. Many people are surprised to find, pleasantly surprised, I should say, that their worst fears are disproven when they actually check in with what the other person is thinking or feeling. Like, hey, will you think I'm selfish if I do this? No, not at all. That's good for both of us. That's good for the whole family. Like, no, of course not. Thanks for asking. Like, it can actually create a genuine relationship rather than relating to what we think the other person is thinking about us. So those are two of the primary themes that arise in these constraints. The third of these tends to relate to uncertainty, a lack of information, which can be, nerve-wracking in and of itself. Universal human tendency to be a bit nervous when we encounter the unknown. Yeah, it's our perpetual companion, uncertainty at the edge of the unknown. So this could look something like, well, I want to do this, but I don't know how. Like, okay, you don't know how. Are you curious? Could you learn how? Not to make it sound too simple, but when we find ourselves at the edge of the unknown, it is again a normal, universal human tendency to be a bit nervous because the unknown contains all of the good that we have not yet experienced in our lives, as well as all of the bad that we haven't yet experienced. So when you encounter that natural turbulence at the boundary, when you're at the edge of the unknown and uncertainty, in order not to have fear take over and paralyze you, curiosity really helps there. And this can be kind of an inside move, but from that base of security again, you might see what changes if you simply activate a bit of curiosity rather than saying, "Oh God, what's gonna happen?" You say, "Huh, what's gonna happen?" Again, same words, a little different intonation. But when we can activate our curiosity at the edge of the unknown, and we do so in the context of awareness of what we want, then we find ourselves in this situation that says, I don't know how this is going to go, but I know what I want to become of this. If I then walk myself back from that, what does that ask of me in this moment? Now, there may be other themes that arise too regarding the constraints. There may be negative evaluations of yourself. There may be, uh, criticisms, that kind of thing. Like, well, I want to do this, but I'm a total screw up and an idiot, and I've never been good at anything. We could just check for a moment, like, when you entertain that thought, does that make you more or less capable? And generally, entertaining that kind of self-critical thought makes us less capable. Now, again, we can take that idea and we can just send it down to the ground. If I write out, I want this, but I'm a total idiot, and I think to myself, I'm a total idiot. Ooh, terrible. But if I find that awareness of my base of support, maybe I also then find, that idea that I'm a total idiot doesn't grab me the same way. It's still there. I may still need to decondition that a bit, but it doesn't have the same. Now, in other sessions, we'll talk through the emotional situation driving some of those self-critical narratives more. It's a bit off of our beaten path for today, so we'll put a pin in that for the time being. But just know that when you consider those constraints and you notice that within yourself, you can find the base of support and let yourself be buoyed up from that. And you'll begin to find that that counters the psychophysiological collapse of the state of shame. It actually resources you to then consider a bit of reality testing more effectively, to check the anxious machinery of those negative predictions or the mind reading. It allows you a firm base from which to become curious in the face of the unknown. And that will likely help account for probably 80% of the constraints that come up. Like every time I go through this with clients, I find it's amazing how many of these constraints are just the proliferation of anxious thoughts. So we'll see what else could be done with that. Before I carry on, I'll pause for a moment here and we'll see if there are particular questions to explore. So we have this interesting question. What distinguishes spinning off into negative predictions from realistic risk appraisal and mitigation? And it seems to be the case that when we are spinning off into negative predictions, those anxious thoughts, they are untethered and they escalate. The more we engage in that, the more worried we become. what seems to distinguish this is that when we are assessing the situation and we have data to indicate what realistic risks might be, we can then put together a plan to hedge against those risks, essentially to reduce the probability of those potential bad things happening. Now, we never have total elimination of that, or I mean, very rarely do we have total elimination of risk. What I believe distinguishes these things, and what I would suggest as a good rule of thumb, is that you know you're engaged in accurate risk appraisal and mitigation when your sense of anxiety is reduced. So when I engage in accurate appraisal and mitigation of these risks, I'm putting together a plan that confers a sense of agency. These are things I could do. And situations in which I could do these things to reduce the likelihood of bad things happening. That seems very different than the kind of overthinking that occurs in the realm of negative predictions, wherein it's a whole lot of doomsday scenarios, Chicken Little, the sky's falling, but without a plan put in place. And I also suggested that we can see the difference if we invert this as well. Rather than getting caught up in pie in the sky fantasies and positive predictions, which are also disconnected from a basis in reality. Like, we can spiral out either negatively or positively. But if I put together a plan to achieve the goals that I would like to achieve, that's very different. It's a very different use of our cognitive capacity than positive predictions and fantasy. It's saying, well, that's what I want. And that requires this, and that requires this, and that requires this. And I can walk it back to, in the present moment, what is available to me now to increase the probability of those positive things and to decrease the probability of these negative things. So that can be a way for us to distinguish between negative predictions, which are inherently anxiety provoking, and risk appraisal and mitigation, which is inherently anxiety reducing. It gives us more of that sense of agency. Now, if we want to earn back our bandwidth, we're going to see that there may be a number of different goals we have. And as I suggested before, looking over that list of goals indicates certain roles that you have. Again, a role could be parent, a role could be partner, a role could be business owner, a role could be person. We'll start to see that there are big domains under which we can nest these various goals. And again, broadly, for most people, I find that relationships is one big domain, business is one big domain, and health and personal well-being is one big domain. So we'll see that there are two primary strategies here. And which of these we make use of depends entirely on whether or not we're on track toward the accomplishment of that particular goal in a satisfactory timeline. Many people, I find, when I go through this particular practice and we define minimum criteria for goal fulfillment, many people have a sigh of relief in realizing, oh, I'm not so bad off as I thought. But like, I'm actually pretty close, or I've actually already got that in place. I hadn't realized that. Now, if that's the case, if you find that given everything you are currently doing, you are on track in a realistic and a satisfactory timeline, then you're going to make use of, we'll call it the reliability strategy. Your job at that point, in that particular goal, is to reduce deviations from the path. You've got the information then that you're on track. And so the thing to do is exploit that. keep yourself from going off track, which is to say, again, exploit the known pathways. So if we look at these two strategies, the one we can call reliability, we can call it exploitation, we can call it the minimum effective dose, we can call it the Apollonian view, the precise, the predictable, the formulaic almost. We'll contrast that with the other end of this bimodal distribution, which is upside as well as risk. It is the unknown. It is exploration. It is the maximum recoverable volume. And it is Dionysian. It's wild. It's chaotic. So on the one hand, we have chaos. On the other, we have order. On the one hand, we have exploration. On the other, we have exploitation. On the one, we have upside and risk. On the other, we have reliability. On the one, we have maximum recoverable volume. On the other, we have minimum effective dose. Two strategies for dealing with two archetypal forces, one being chaos, one being order. Anything in between those two, it's not the best use of our resources. Here's what I mean. If I'm doing more than the minimum effective dose and less than the maximum recoverable volume, I'm expending more resources and accruing more risk without maximizing my upside. And likewise, if I'm not quite doing the maximum, but it's more than the minimum effective dose, well, there it's expensive and it's risk without the utmost reward. And I find for a lot of people who are spread very thin, they're overwhelmed, it seems like they can never quite get ahead of whatever tasks, they're constantly putting out fires. They tend to be doing more than they need to do and not as much as they could do to actually reap the upside. So they're creating a progressively more fragile position for themselves. So again, the question regarding these various goals is, are you currently on track to achieve that in a satisfactory timeline? If yes, you want to bias reliability. Because if it's good enough and fast enough, well, you just want to make sure you're not getting derailed. In which case, your job is to identify what are the particular things that are going to throw me off track. If, however, you look at that and your honest gut hunch is, no, I'm not on track, or I'm not on track in a satisfactory timeline, well, then you got to look at the explore side. Essentially, you have to do something new if you're not on track, or you're not on track in a satisfactory timeline. The challenge is that every new thing, as well as all the upside it can provide, every new thing introduces risk. So we then want to reduce our risk whenever possible. One of the rules of thumb that we've introduced elsewhere is checking out a new thing against 4 filters. This is especially applicable in a business context. But if I'm going to go do a new thing for my business, I want to make sure that it is using my resources effectively. And in order to do that, I can run it through a series of 4 questions. And I want to be able to answer yes to at least 2 of them. So the first question is this a forcing function? Will this require me or incentivize me to get something off of my plate, to do something that I've been putting off, to free up my mental space? Give me a little bit of bandwidth there. That's one question. The second is, will doing this thing save me time now or in the future? The third question is, will this thing reduce costs? And ideally, do I have data to demonstrate that? The fourth question is, will this thing generate revenue? And again, rather than having a hunch, do I have data to demonstrate that it will generate revenue? So before I go and do a new thing in my business, I'm going to ask these four questions about that new thing. If this new offer that I could put together is successful, is this a forcing function? Will this save me time now or in the future? Will this cut costs? And will this generate revenue? If I'm looking to hire a new person, is this a forcing function? Have I been putting this off? Will this free up my bandwidth? Will this save me time? Will this cut me costs? Will this generate revenue? If I'm putting together a new email campaign, is this a forcing function? Is this going to save time? Will it cut costs? Will it generate revenue? A lot of the times when we're losing bandwidth, we're getting caught up fixating on one of our resources, generally cash, and we neglect to consider that everything I do for cash has other costs: time, energy, potentially cash for fulfillment. So if I'm not on track for the fulfillment of a goal in a satisfactory timeline, then I've got to look around and find some new thing to do. And ideally, it's a new thing wherein I can buffer against the risks of novelty by finding a more leveraged option, which, again, in the business case at least, could check at least two of those four boxes. Now, I'll pause there again and we'll see if there are particular questions that arise. So you have a number of roles and a number of goals. And again, I'm going to use, just as a general example, relationships, business, health. In your heart of hearts right now, I would bet anything that you can identify which one of these is your primary constraint. Like, boy, if I just figured out that, these other things would be much easier to deal with. I'd have so much more bandwidth available to deal with these things if I just took care of that. I know I've worked with clients in the past who are dealing with chronic health issues. And it's like, oh, by God, we've got to get you off the toilet 12 times a day so that you can be more available for your business and your relationships. Yeah. Quite often it's the thing that we've been avoiding that thing. That's common. It may be the case, and I've recently worked with a couple of clients who find that the primary constraint is their relationship. I think of one guy in particular where health was dialed in, business was dialed in, but he was going through a separation. And so he worked with me basically like the most intensive offer that I've ever put together. We're doing sessions like 5 or 6 days a week and a couple of in-person days, intense. But he was all in on the relationship because he realized, wow, if this relationship falls apart, this other stuff doesn't matter if I don't have someone to share this with, and it's going to hurt our kids, and it's going to cost us, over $1 million if we, then go and separate. So you've got a gut hunch of what that key constraint is, and what many people will do, and they'll get caught up on this endless loop then of panic, essentially, is they'll get very reactive and they'll just focus entirely on that one thing. They'll say, oh my God, I'm gonna all hands on deck, we've got to take care of this. And they'll neglect these other roles in their lives. And that's a recipe for disaster. If you focus on one of these roles at the cost of neglecting the others, things are going to fall apart. We just know that's a rule of the universe. Things fall apart on their own. So it is very important that you prioritize one of these domains. Let's say you decide that if you get your business dialed in, it's going to make your relationships better and your health is going to get better. But business is the thing that needs your focus. You put a star there, let's say. But before you then go all hands on deck on your business, the most important step, and this is what all of this workshop hinges on, the most important step is determining for those other areas, what is the minimum action needed to keep those things from backsliding? So you're going to essentially see the bimodal distribution at work here. Your priority area is going to get the maximum recoverable volume. But in order to do that sustainably, these other areas need to have the minimum effective dose defined. So what is the least amount you could do in each of those domains to keep things from falling apart? For example, if you want to maintain your strength levels, you could reasonably do that with one good training session every 2 weeks. Now, you're not going to increase your strength that way, but you're not going to lose your strength that way. Or maybe you find for your relationships, a good maintenance level is a date night each week and 90 minutes to talk about the relationship each week, to work on the relationship. I borrow that recommendation from Jordan Peterson. Love him or hate him, I think that's a good recommendation. If you have a date night each week and you have 90 minutes to work on the relationship can hover. It'll coast. It's not going to get dramatically better, probably. It's not going to get dramatically worse. And that's what we're really focused on here, is how to prevent backsliding by identifying the minimum criteria, the minimum actions you can take to keep that domain and that domain from falling apart. Now, again, I'm using the example of 3 big domains. You may have finer slices. It may be parent and partner and business owner and scholar and athlete and spiritual devotee or whatever, slice it however you like. Each of these areas has a minimum amount of work required to keep it on track as is. Now, again, a lot of people find even having defined the minimum actions to maintain, it's a sigh of relief. And the sense of overwhelm just drains out because they've specified, oh, if I just do that, at least things aren't going to get worse. Now, you lock in the minimum effective dose on these things. And what that then makes available to you is to give your maximum recoverable volume to this one domain, that if you just brought this to its level of desired performance, everything else would be easier. So again, it's important to define what is going to be good enough, because you can't sustain maximum recoverable volume forever. It is the maximum from which you can recover. But if you could take this one area from this level of performance, let's say you're taking home 5,000 a month from your business and you want to take home 10,000 a month from your business. Okay. That's going to take some work to bring this up here, which means it's going to be resource investment that can't go to relationships, can't go to health. But if these things are being maintained, then you've got more resources available to lift this up to here. So it is a big investment of work, the maximum recoverable volume, to realistically bring this thing as quickly as possible up to this new level. Now, when it's at this new level, it can be maintained here with less work than it took to bring it here. but the bringing it there takes a good amount of work. So when you have successfully brought your top priority to the desired level of performance, then you figure out, well, what's it going to take to maintain this here? Then you turn your attention to which of these things is now the priority. And maybe you then say, well, okay, health can still stay there. And business is going to coast along at this level now, and I'm going to maintain it here. But I'm going to bring my relationship from this current level up to this current level. And maybe now that I've brought my business from 5K up to 10K, maybe then I can afford to work with a really great couples counselor. And so we're going to really just like take our relationship to the next level. Or we're going to go on this incredible couples retreat to I don't know, yada yada somewhere east nowheresville, wherever the case is, or we're going to bring our relationship up to this level while maintaining this domain here and that domain there. Again, when we define the minimum actions required to maintain the current level of function, then that makes us available for the maximum in our priority area. The priority area, again, being the thing which would make all the other things easier. If that one thing were sorted out, boy, everything else would be easier to get a handle. So let me pause there for a moment. So we have this really important idea introduced, which is that at different points in time, we'll recognize that our values may have shifted. Our priorities will change as certain situations become resolved. We'll become more available to then focus on other areas, or we may find actually that a focus on one of these other areas could improve the thing that we've been focused on in ways that hadn't been obvious before. So if, for example, I've been really focused on my business and it's, it's good enough, it's getting there, I may also decide, actually, the more I think about it, if I just dialed in my relationships or if I got my health a little more the way that I'd like it to be, maybe that indirectly or through the back door increases the way my business performs. Certainly as solopreneurs, that tends to be the case. If we're executive level, that tends to be the case. When we make ourselves better, we will tend to perform better in the business. If I improve my health physiologically, I'm a better biological engine for my business. If I sort out my mindset and mental health, I will think more clearly in my business. And it may be the case that, boy, actually, if I focus on myself, if I just get this like worry and overthinking and anxious kind of taken care of, then I'm going to be more clear-headed and more focused in my business. I'm going to be able to actually like zoom in and do what needs doing more effectively. We've got this shifting landscape here. Hopefully, these ideas we've talked about thus far make it so that it's not merely random shifting landscape, that there's a little method to the madness in terms of thinking through what's my primary constraint, which of these areas, if I just made this better, would make everything else better. So my lead domino, let's say. And then rather than just reactively hyper focus on that, become fixated, can we think in terms of that bimodal distribution and figure out the minimum effective dose to keep the other areas from backsliding, and then give basically everything left over to this one priority. And this keeps us from that all too common situation where people just get in like the loop of putting out fires. This thing's blowing up. Okay, I'll take care of that. Oh God, now that thing blew up. And okay, I'll take care of that. And this thing's going crazy. I'll take care of that. I think every business owner can relate to that in some way. But in large part, that kind of thing can be It can be prevented by, let's say this area really is on fire. It's like, well, that's on fire. Okay. Before I fixate on that, can I make sure no other fires are like, can I just look around and see? Okay, are there other things that need taken care of too? No, okay, I'll take care of that. That local fire may get a little worse in the short term. If it takes you an hour to think through the minimum effective dose to take care of this thing and this thing, okay, this fire's burning for an hour, but at least then when you put it out, these other things haven't also caught on fire. So I find that this interrupts the habitual reactive thing people tend to do. Um, in other sessions, of course, we're going to talk about like the emotional mastery components. Yeah, less susceptible to the reactive. This is blowing up. Let me become fixated here. But for the time being, since that'll also carry us a little far afield, we'll just say that when you identify your priority, take the extra mental step to ensure that you've got guardrails in place on these other things, to ensure that you have reinforced the floor on these areas so they don't sink before you go and focus on this priority. And just doing that extra mental step to preserve these other areas, it will increase so much bandwidth because then you can focus on this thing without a whole bunch of worry about if these other things are okay. Or at least you're pretty sure they're okay because you've defined the minimum criteria to keep them okay. And then you've taken all the leftovers of your time, energy, attention, cash, etc., and deployed those leftovers in the maximum recoverable volume to your priority. And having defined what's good enough for that priority, you can raise it to that level without these other areas falling apart as you do so. It may take a little longer to raise it to that level than if you just ignored these things entirely. Like you could just splash all the water over here. You got a bucket of water and something's on fire, you just. But if you pour all of the water onto that fire and something else is on fire too, well, hey, you're out of water and now you've got another problem on your hands. So you got to then go fill up the bucket and go. So if you've got a little thing here, a little thing here, and a big thing here, okay, little thing, whatever's left over, I'm going to give to the big thing, which tends to be the inverse of how we normally react to these situations. But again, I think you'll find this sets up an incredible engine of performance. Not only does this help us buffer against the possibility of burnout, but once we've actually gone and built something fireproof, instead of having to go put out fires, then we can just reliably increase one area and the next area and the next area while preserving the gains we've accrued in these other areas. And that, quite frankly, is all there is to it. Now, I say that's all there is to it. I know this has been a bunch of talking, but that's all there is to it in terms of the bandwidth blueprint. We're going to figure out what our priorities are. We're going to determine what constitutes good enough for each of the goals. And then one goal at a time, I'm going to prioritize while preserving and protecting my progress in other areas. Then this gets everything I've got left over until it's functioning as I'd like it to. And then I'm going to maintain this, protect and preserve, because so long as you don't lose, like that's Warren Buffett's big rule, don't lose the principle. If you just eliminated backsliding so that your health never decreased, your business never fell off, your relationships never erupted, even if you didn't reap all of the upside, you'd be in great shape. Like if you considered your net wealth right now, if you had gone back in time and never lost any money, be rolling in cash now. If I had never, had any times where my health just collapsed. I look at my mood. If I had avoided cataclysmic depressions, oh, would have saved so much time long term, boy, because things falling apart is expensive. So in terms of this bandwidth blueprint, we're looking to protect, preserve, and then deploy everything we've got to our priorities. And when we get in the habit of that, we'll find that we create a more sustainable engine toward driving us to get and keep, again, that's the important thing, getting and keeping what we want. We're just going to bake the keeping of that into our normal operations for how we go about living our lives. All right, so in summary here, hopefully you can see how this engine comes into play. What we are essentially looking to do is only ever solve each problem once. We're looking to solve these problems in a way that conserves our resources. When we remove a constraint, that will inevitably make available more of our resources. But over and over again, we can define our minima, and we can then deploy all the leftovers into the maximum volume given to our primary constraint. We fix that problem. We solve it once and we solve it well. We maintain it at that next level, and we just rinse and repeat. And it gets to be a very beautiful process. Now, that said, I recognize this is a lot of information. If you do have any questions on application of these or implementation in greater depth, well, you know where to reach me, and we can cover more of this in ongoing Q&A sessions too. So be well, and we'll talk to you soon.